Okay, here's the unit on scales, unit number 4. And the reason that I had you start with half steps and whole steps is to kind of orient yourself towards what we're going to be doing in this particular chapter, which is to create scales. And scales really are what we use for our vocabulary, creating keys and creating our chords. Our melodies are written based on scales. And so in theory, you want to know how to construct the different types of scales. And I decided to go ahead and start with the major scale first because it's the easiest type of scale to describe. Now there are two different kinds of scale primarily. The chromatic scale, which we talked about, is just half step after half step, one half step after another. And so generally there's no key associated with a chromatic scale since it encompasses all notes. The kind of scales that we mostly use are diatonic, a series of 8 tones, one to the other. One after another until you get to the 8th tone, which is, of course, the octave. Most of our scales are called diatonic, a series of whole steps and half steps to create the scales themselves. And so, as I mentioned, I want to start off with a major scale since it's definitely the simplest one to understand and to hear. It's basically, for a lack of a better way to describe it, major sounds pretty happy and minor sounds sad. So we're definitely dealing with the one that sounds more happy. And in the book, you'll see that I've created a series of whole steps and half steps, and I'm representing them the same way that we did in the book, which is the first step is a whole step, the next step is also a whole step, then there's a half step, another whole step, whole step, whole step, and then finally a half step at the end. And so that's the way that we construct that particular scale. And down below here, you'll see what it looks like when I actually start on the note C as the bottom note. That's called the tonic note. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go from C all the way up the alphabet until I get to C again. So you know that we do 7 letters all the way up to B, and then when I go back to C, I will be 1 octave away, 8 tones away. And so to construct a C major scale, it will be C, up a whole step to D, D up a whole step to E, then the next step has to be a half step, E to F, which we of course know is a half step, and then F to G, the next note is going to be a whole step. G needs to go up a whole step to A, and then A also needs to go up another whole step, or the next note does, and that's a B. If we're right, the next combination should be a half step to the octave. B natural to D, or B to C rather, is going to be a half step. And so that construction there creates a major scale. A C major scale, as you can see, has no sharps or flats, no accidentals whatsoever. It's the only scale that does that. All the other scales are going to require sharps or flats to make up the entire scale itself. And one little interesting note about the scales, if in major scales, if you have even 1 sharp in it, it's going to continue to have sharps as accidentals. There will never be any flats in that major scale. And the same goes with the flats. If you have a flat, it's going to continue to have flats. You'll not ever mix the flats and the sharps together in a major scale. In a minor scale, we will, but not in a major. So again, when you look at this scale on the second page, I have the C scale there all over again, and again, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. If we start on a different note, I'm starting on G this time, and I'm going to go G to G. If I create that same pattern, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, I will end up with a accidental in there. Because, as I said before, C, starting on C, is the only one in which you will not have an accidental. So we go from G up a whole step to A up a whole step to B, B only up a half step to C, C up a whole step to D, D up a whole step to E, and then E needs to go also as a whole step. And we know that if we didn't put this sharp here on the F, it would have been a half step, and that wouldn't have created a major scale. So we need to turn that F into an F sharp. We cannot change the E because we've already determined that the E fits the pattern. So F becomes F sharp. If the scale is right, it should be a half step to the tonic to G, and it is. F sharp to G is a half step. So the scale of G major has one sharp in it, F sharp. And that's going to be consistent. It always has one sharp, G major does. When we get to the next unit, unit number 5, we'll see that key signatures will place those sharps and flats for us. Right now we're kind of getting into the construction of the scales based on these half-step, whole-step patterns. And I still think that that's a good way to look at it, because then you certainly understand why the scale a key signature produces the sharps or flats that it does, because it is related completely to the construction of a half-step, whole-step design for the scales themselves. So in the textbook, I was asking you to, if you would, designate, just like before, whole steps as a marking like this, and then the half steps more like a little circle, like not a circle, but a half circle, like a slur sign. And then to, in the textbook, continue to write scales based on each one of the notes. Now I'm going to take a separate sheet of paper and write a couple of these scales based on the notes that I'm beginning with. So I'm going to change over to a secondary sheet. Okay, so I have this manuscript paper here, and I'm going to construct some scales for you based on my starting note. I'm going to construct major scales. So I'm going to start with an A. And the first thing you should do is to draw out the rest of the notes. Make sure you're putting all of the 8 notes down so that you won't make a mistake about which note comes next. Okay, that would be my suggestion to you. And initially, go ahead and put whole, whole, half, whole, 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 and half. Now, by doing so, you know that you're going to eventually come up with an A major scale. So we start with A to B is a whole step, so we're okay. But now B to C, which is naturally a half step, can't occur in this scale, so I have to take the C and raise it. And of course the sharp sign is what raises it. Then we have confirmed that an A major scale is going to be a sharp scale. The rest of the accidentals will be sharps. The next combination is a half step, C sharp to D, good, D is okay. Whole step, D to E, yes. E to F, no, because that's a half step. And again, we realize that it's a sharp that we have to add. So F becomes sharp. And then, of course, that changes this. G, F sharp to G is a half step, so we also must change the G to a G sharp. At that point, we do have a whole step, F sharp to G sharp. And then the half step back to the tonic, or up to the tonic. G sharp to A is a half step. So this is an A major scale. A is an A major scale, La. And so you're going to have this combination when you have an A major. We will learn that A major always has 3 sharps, and it's going to be those 3 sharps. So now let's try a flat note and see if what kind of results we get from that. I'm going to start on just an arbitrary note. Why don't I go ahead and just use A again, but this time we'll make it A flat. Okay, so then I'll build my scale, go up the scale. Of course, your last note has to also be an A flat. Create the whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. So, and you can see right away there's going to be something that needs to be manipulated here, because the A flat going to a B natural actually is further away than an A to a B, which is already a whole step. So I'm actually doing a step and a whole step and a half. So I must turn this into B flat because I need to get it closer to that A flat. A lot of times you can look at this and just say, what would this be if it didn't have the flat in front of it? It would have been A natural to B natural, which is a whole step. So when I turn this into A flat, I've actually made it go further backwards. And so if something's a whole step with natural notes, meaning with no signs, then it will also be a whole step if you put the same accidental in front of each of those notes. So an A flat going to a B flat will become a whole step. Now in this situation here, because a B to a C is a half step, well now it's a B flat, so it's lower. So this actually has turned into a whole step. B flat to C is a whole step. So I'm not going to change the C in this situation here. The next series of notes though has to be C to D has to be a half step, and C to D is a whole step. And again, since we have flats here, we know that this is going to be a flat. I'm lowering it so that C now goes to D flat, which would be the proper note. By doing that, I've already changed what's going on with this relationship. Normally, D to E is a whole step. Now this is further. This is a whole step and a half. So I'm going to take that E and also turn it into a flat. So now both of those being flat creates a whole step. And then over here, because E was next to F, which was a half step, but now it's turned into E flat, is already a whole step. So we leave that alone. And then the next one needs to be a whole step too. F to G. And F to G is already a whole step. And then finally, G to A flat is a half step. So that particular scale now is A flat major. A little 1/2 step lower than A major, but major because the relationship of the notes is still the exact same pattern, using whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. And then what we will learn is A flat is a key signature that has 4 flats. We don't call that an extra flat because it's already there. So we have only 4 flats in this particular scale. And that will be consistent with our key signatures in the next unit. And essentially, that is the way you construct major scales. Based on that pattern, it will be consistent with whichever note I start with. Any note that I present you with at the beginning will create a major scale if you use that whole step, half step pattern.